Hi, hello, welcome. We're just going to give it just a minute or so while the numbers are still jumping up. Hi, everybody, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Great to see you. Okay. Welcome to Open Research Week. Right, I'm actually going to kick off because we've stabilized in numbers. So welcome to today's GW4 Open Research Week and this session on rewarding open research from policy to practice. My name's Claire Fraser. I'm GW4's Research Culture Officer. And I also have a background working on responsible research assessment reform, particularly at a system-wide level with international funding agencies. And I'm absolutely delighted to host this session today. So I'm joined by colleagues from Leiden University, University College London, Bath, Bristol and Exeter. And I thank them all for their contributions to what should be a really interesting session this afternoon. And I'll introduce everybody as we go through. So by way of introduction, really, for me, research assessment sits at the centre of the research system. It has such a powerful influence on what research is done, how it's done, and how it's shared. Essentially, what the system chooses to reward, whether that's via funding or via hiring and promotion and recognition practices, shapes our behaviours across individuals, institutions, organisations, and the system itself. And for a long time, research assessment relied on a narrow set of indicators for quality and excellence, often prioritising where research was published or kind of easily countable outputs over the how research was conducted or what it contributed. And over the past, I can't believe I'm going to say this, but over the past kind of 12, 15 years or so, there's been a growing recognition that these approaches are not just limited, but they actively distort research being delivered and the research culture that we work within. So this has driven a real global movement for responsible research assessment reform. Initiatives seeking signatories, such as the Declaration on Research Assessment, which is known as DORA, that was began in 2012, and CoARA, which is the Coalition for Advancement of Research Assessment in 2022, as well as other interventions such as the Metric Tide report in the UK, the Global Research Council's work around research assessment reform. There's a project within the Research on Research Institute around a global observatory on responsible research assessment, and other principles such as the Hong Kong principles. And this is just kind of to name a few, so it shows the momentum really that's being built. These things build on one another, and the call for fair assessment, they all call really for fair assessment, which is more transparent, more inclusive, and really better aligned with the values that we want to reflect. At GW4, there's a commitment from the GW4 organisations to these movements. So Bristol, Bath, Exeter and Cardiff have signed DORA, and Exeter and Bristol have recently signed CoARA. So responsible research assessment movement really matters, particularly for open research. And the two movements, as you'd say, perhaps you'd call them, are closely linked. And Brian Nosek's work highlights this. I think Brian's kind of piece around research culture change says researchers generally hold strong values around transparency, but are skeptical that the culture rewards the behaviours associated with those values. And in other words, there's that gap. There's a gap between what researchers believe in and what they feel safe or incentivised to do. So when we talk around rewarding open research from policy to practice, we're really thinking about how to ensure that our assessment practices of individuals, of research and research systems support the kind of culture that we want to see. So I'm going to stop there with the introduction and hand over to speakers. That I'd like to encourage participants to pop any questions you have in the Q&A. Your engagement is really important throughout the session, and we've got panel discussion later on, so we'd really value your input. So in terms of our first speaker, I'd like to thank Alex Rushforth. Alex is an assistant professor at CWTS, Leiden University, and Alex shared a recording for us in advance of the session today, as Alex is at a retreat this week. Alex and the research team have conducted a content analysis of CoARA action plans. CoARA action plans have to be submitted by signatories of CoARA within a year of signing the commitment. And the purpose of the action plans is not only to seek advocacy for change, but also to make sure there's commitment to actively drive reform and assessment. And the analysis that Alex and the team have conducted focuses on the ways in which the CoARA action plans support open research. So I'm going to share Alex's presentation now. Here we go.
Hello, everybody. Thank you to the organisers for inviting me to the event. I'm only sorry I couldn't be there in person, but it's my pleasure to leave you with a few minutes of short recorded slides about this recent study that I've been working on with my colleagues on advancing open science through research assessment reform. It's a collaborative effort with these colleagues where we've been looking at explicit mentions of open science terms within CoARA action plans. By a quick word of background, open science and research assessment reform are often thought to be compatible fellow travellers, fellow reform movements that, in a sense, need each other and are aligned on their values. The title of this workshop from last year, for example, talks about science and research assessment reform being two sides of the same coin. It's understandable why these movements are seen as compatible with each other and needing each other. Especially from the open science perspective, I think it's often something that open science campaigners have encountered. So when they've tried to advocate for new types of open science practices and values, they've sometimes come up against the problems around dysfunctions in research assessment and the types of incentives that this produces for researchers, which typically then go against the values of open science and mean that the values are never really unlocked and realized. But we wanted to look at this empirically. And we were able to do so opportunistically via the recent public availability of action plans. So these provide an interesting way of exploring and monitoring the relationship between these two movements, asking in particular are signatories of CoARA as a leading reform initiative, building open science into their reform plans. Just a word on action plans. As many of you will surely know, these are written plans for change that individual organizational signatories of CoARA make publicly available. And the spirit of CoARA states that the plans should be specific to the organization's own missions, strategic needs, and resource situation. So you would expect some variability across the action plans as well as some convergences. So with this type of method, we're able to ask certain types of questions. So we're able to look at this broader question of how do CoARA signatories articulate open science commitments in their action plans. We're able to also compare different categories of open science terms. So I will come back to this in a slide, but we distinguish between three types of open science terms. So there's the umbrella terms, values terms, and operational terms. And as I say, I'll come back to this in the next slide. And we're also just interested in which open science terms appear commonly across action plans and which terms that are in the discourse are rarely mentioned or absent altogether in the context of action plans. We were able at the time of the study to download 248 action plans that we're able to use from the CoARA Zenodo repository. We use a quantitative manifest content analysis approach where we look for explicit mentions of terms and count these essentially. We were able to generate two different types of data set. One was a binary presence absence data set. So for each document, we would just record that either a given term was mentioned or it wasn't. And then we also were able to collect frequency of mentions within a given document as well. So the glossary is available in the preprints and the R script to extract and code the data, and the data itself, so the binary and the frequency data sets, are publicly available via Zenodo. So on the coding framework, we distinguish between three types of open science terms, and we're able to compare across these through our aggregated results. So we have umbrella terms. So this refers to terms basically like open science, open research, so terms that summarize the movement, that capture the movement. Then we have values terms. So these tend to be terms that are more based on abstract principles around which there's some level of societal consensus. For example, collaboration, transparency, equity, inclusion, and so on. Then we have the operational terms. So these are the terms that are more specific, if you like, to the open science movement, recognizable to these open science practices, tools, policies, infrastructures. And again, it's good to sort of define these through examples. So open access, fair data, pre-registration, open peer review. These are practices, tools, policies, infrastructures that are associated closely with the open science movements. Just a quick word on the signatories, so who has actually deposited these action plans. So the majority of the signatories that have deposited action plans within this sample were universities, according to CoARA. Fairly even spread across regions of Europe, albeit it's worth pointing out that it is a European sample, essentially. So only 2% of organizations who have signed CoARA and deposited signatories at the time of December 2025 came from outside of Europe. So it does suggest that our sample is European, as is, in a sense, the CoARA initiative in terms of its signatories so far. So on to which terms are popular. Well, out of the umbrella terms, I know within certain countries like the UK, there's sometimes efforts to rebrand open science and make it into the more inclusive open research. It does suggest that, of course, here open science is still the preferred term, or the sort of general term around which there's some agreement and recognition. Open research appears in 38 separate documents, but open science is in well over half of all documents. Then these other terms, open scholarship and open knowledge, are peripheral in terms of their mentions. So it's not important to see the actual figures here, but all I want to do with this figure is just to show you the skewness of the data. So certain terms get mentioned quite a lot. A handful of terms really get mentioned quite a lot, but the majority don't appear in a large number of documents. And indeed, actually, over half of the terms in our glossary are not even on this figure because they are mentioned in fewer than 10 documents. So in a sense, they don't actually make it onto the figure. So this really shows a long tail and a skewed distribution of data, and that certain open science terms get mentioned quite a lot and others don't. So in terms of the most commonly used open science terms across action plans, open science, the umbrella term open science, is the one that's most frequently used and mentioned across different action plans. So 167 separate action plans out of 248 mention open science at least once. But after this, apart from open access, every other term within the top 10 are values-based terms. So we'll come back to what this might mean shortly, but it does largely suggest that the top tier of mentioned terms are dominated by values language. A quick note on terms that we perhaps expected to feature a bit more widely when setting out and were somewhat surprised by. So these are terms that are prominent either in the meta-science movement or in authoritative statements like from the likes of UNESCO and Science Europe on open science. So this perhaps suggests that policy and research level discourse is somewhat removed at the moment from the kinds of reforms that are happening on the ground so far and the sorts of terms that organizations are able to engage with and are seeking to recognize and reward. So overall, we see that values terms tend to be more prominent and more widespread than operational terms. So this would suggest perhaps that in a more nascent movement and a still emerging movement, there isn't yet that much investment and attention to rewarding specific open science practices, and it's on the level of values where the compatibilities between open science and research assessment reform are most empirically striking within this data set. Perhaps this is not surprising, as in a sense we're still all working out once we sign CoARA, how do we actually go about recognizing and rewarding open science? You know, should we be doing this? How should we be doing this? All of these kinds of questions are still somewhat up for grabs. So perhaps it's understandable that certain operational terms are marginal or not as prominent as we might expect. So overall, then, I think the benefits of this kind of study is it provides an exploratory early read on an emerging field, a systematic snapshot of what organizations are saying publicly around open science. It's a kind of non-invasive method, so it's one whereby the data is naturalistically occurring, so there isn't this kind of desirability bias that instruments like interviews or surveys sometimes introduce, where in a sense the respondents try to impress us, the researchers. So this is data that was publicly available, so we think it's quite credible in that sense. The useful approach of this as well is that it is reproducible, so it is an approach that others can pick up using our glossary or adapting our glossary if they so wish, using our R script. They can also pick up our data and try to replicate the findings. So it's quite a useful monitoring approach that can be adapted going forwards as the field of open science evolves. Certain words might drop out, certain words may join and become more popular that aren't really on the radar now. So this is an approach that's really useful for monitoring the convergence of these two fields and for providing process data for evaluations of reforms, essentially. A couple of health warnings. So this is really a surface level approach. So you can look at and infer things about commitments and discourse and whatnot. But what it definitely is not is a proof of implementation. It doesn't really tell us anything about the context of the use of these individual terms. So for that, you, of course, do need qualitative methods. It also depends upon the adequacy of the framework, of the glossary that's in use. So we were pretty confident about our glossary and that it was at a high level of quality. We were able to draw on lots of different sources of open science and our own knowledge of the field across our experienced research team. And likewise, we got 2 external experts to independently audit our list and suggest things that we missed. So we're fairly confident overall in the robustness of the framework, but of course one could always argue the toss and say certain words shouldn't be in there, certain terms should be. So we ask really for defensibility rather than perfection in these kinds of terms, these kind of term glossaries. So thank you very much for your attention. Again, I'm really sorry that I couldn't be there in person. But if you have any comments or questions, then you can access the preprint via this QR code and via this URL link. And please do drop me an email if you're interested in the results of the study and the approach that we took. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the week. Bye-bye.
Great. So, well, I wanted to express my thanks for Alex's contribution, and no doubt the fantastic panel members will reflect on this intervention later in the session today. Next up, I'm delighted to introduce Banaz Jalil, Research Fellow, Senior Project Officer and Institutional Coordinator for the Open Research Programme at University College London. The project Banaz leads aims to reform the ways in which institutions recruit, promote and appraise their staff to better reward open research practices. And we're delighted to have Banaz to share these insights today. So I'll hand it over to you. Can you unmute?
Great, great. So is my slides clear, right? In your perspective? All good?
They look good. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much, Claire, and really appreciating the kind invitation. So to start swiftly, I'm Banaz Jalil. I'm working at UCL as the Institutional Coordinator for Open Research Program, but I'm also the project manager for the OR4 project, the UKRN OR4 project. In other part, I'm a research fellow at UCL as well. So to start with, so within the Open Research Program, we have the OR4 project, which refers to the open and reproducible open research, reproducible and reward and recognition project. And that project really aims to reform the current assessment of researchers. It's a consortium of 24 institutions, which comes under the umbrella of Open UKRN Open Research Program. As you can see with this slide, it's basically mainly to show different outputs and deliverable and areas that we are involved in within the Open Research Program. So within the assessment of institutional practices, we have a maturity framework, we have the toolkit. Within the action plan, we have generated a landscape review, we have a suggested action table, and we have a guidance for high quality open research practices. We have an implementation guide, and we do also local co-design. At the same time, we evaluate and we do have an institutional report from the UKRN, and we have the institutional practice and policy survey, what we call it OR4 survey, which have been conducted in 2023, and now this year we will be running it again in 2026. So with the assessment of institutional practices within the UKRN OR4 project, we have developed a toolkit which aims for recognizing and rewarding open research. This toolkit consists of three main components. So it starts with the maturity framework and self-assessment tool, which really aims and with the ambition to enable an institution to assess their current maturity and in the implementation of relevant practices and policies. We do have also developed an implementation guide, which provide a detailed practical guidance within each area of the maturity framework. We do have a suggested action table, which summarizes the actions taken by the UKRN community to move between these maturity levels. As you can see, it's targeted at the institutional leaders, but also any stakeholders involved in the reforming, but also rewarding and recognizing open research and researchers' assessment. The toolkit is planned to be evolved until 2027. To start with, as I mentioned, the maturity framework and the self-assessment tool, it consists of 9 areas of action, and it comes under 3 themes. The themes are strategy and leadership, we have implementation, and we do have managing progress. And as I said, under these ones comes 9 areas for action. For maturity, we have 4 levels of maturity, starting from no action to emerging to evolving to sustain. And this all being shaped with the input from the OR4 community of practice, which currently consists of 54 members within the institutions. As I said, we have also the implementation guides, which provide detailed practical guidance for each area of the maturity framework. And this taps on the 9 action area that I have mentioned, supported by different case studies being kindly provided by the institutions. We have also within the maturity framework what we call a suggested action table or toolkit in brief. And this one provide a really practical approach to it, which is a summary of the action taken by the UKRN community, how they moved from one maturity level to another. And as you can see, it is surrounded by the structured but supported by the 9 areas for the action. However, it also comes from the mapping progression from the no action to the sustained. And as you can see, you see different institutions who kindly provided their case studies here. Now, moving swiftly to our second part of the OR4 project, where we are looking into providing evidence, but also into action plans. And with that, we have developed a landscape review. The landscape review the ambition of it was to map the global landscape of open science, open research, but also researchers' assessment. So with that, we have different approaches really looking into the how do we check for these documents, or how was our inclusion criteria. We've done double or multiple method search strategy at the same time. We have looked into resources covering the period between 2012 to until the end of 2025. We had to go fast forward to our result when we have included. We have included 100 document resources, and within these 100 document we saw a regional, above half, we have a regional production, which is mainly dominated by Europe. 71% are resources which is written for the global audience. 58% are addressing the responsible research assessment, and we have 44 focusing on open science and fair data. However, we've already seen a peak also between 2021 and 22 within the kind of documents being produced, which really shows that the openness was an ambition, but it also was an approach during the COVID pandemic. So looking at the audience, specifically, we had 17 different types of resources, and it was mainly supported by reports and toolkit as the majority. We had 25 themes across the document we have included, and they were dominated by the responsible research assessment, open science, and fair data. And I have to add also that was something we struggled with within the document, the term for open science and open knowledge and open research, as my the previous speaker, Alex, have kindly highlighted. The target audience of these documents were mainly the research performer organization, because they're the center of the culture change, but also they've been somehow also addressed toward funders and researchers. We have identified within the 100 document and the landscape review that it shows the maturing of the the open research ecosystem, which is increasingly shaped by regional collaboration, but also the current global dissemination that's happening. but also the assessment reform and openness, sharing data openly are really the main driver for change within our landscape review revealed. Of course, there are some limitations, and we aim to update these landscape review hopefully as we are progressing. If you are interested, please, I will be sharing the QR codes later on or the links if needed. Moving on to another output of the project, we have produced also a high quality open research guidance. The main, as we are aware, and I think many people are currently aware, there are some challenges with the research assessment that we're mainly focusing on the metrics. There are some fragmented and compliance-based approaches there. There are some issues with the recognition and rewarding of open research practices. At the same time, you see that somehow, by indirectly, this is impacting the transparency and the rigor of research. At the same time, there is a lack of guidance how assessors really should be evaluating open or good research practices. At the same time, how candidates should be providing evidence and a case when they are practicing open research. With that in mind, we have developed a guidance which is basically looks at how if you are a panel member, how should you be looking at someone who is practicing open research? What's considered what good looks like? At the same time, how a candidate or a researcher should be showing their good practices. Of course, this is sometimes problematic because this will be defined by different discipline, but also career stages. So as I mentioned, it's really targeted into candidates and researchers, and it's really provide practical guidance. How can you demonstrate your commitment, but over the years when you going through promotion, also within your career stage and discipline specific. At the same time, for assessor and panel members, what's good looks like, and how should we be supporting researchers, and how should be moving in their career while they are practicing these good practices. The guidance is also targeted into institutional leaders who are aiming to shape any reforming research assessment, but also for anyone who is supporting research or research supporting staff. At the same time, we are ambitious that's really reaching the policymaker in this regard as well. For some final remarks on the high quality guidance, the practices in scope, we have different practices being really included in this guidance. However, as we are progressing and we are identifying different practices within different discipline could be changing or evolving, this would need evolvement and development as we are progressing. However, this is a good start, we believing, to make a case, but also for those involved in the promotion. So that's basically bring me to the end of my presentation. With that in mind, I'm going back to my first slide saying that this is the areas that we basically cover within OR4 with basically the practice, the survey, that's something we are currently focusing on. We are ambitious with all our outputs that we are really able to build more collaboration, that we are pushing for more adapting and adoption of the current guidance, but also the output and evidence we are creating. We are hoping that we are able to further develop what we are producing within the project, and we are quite keen into disseminating it and in the hope of further adoption and changing research, well, reforming research assessment. So thank you very much, and that's the end.
Thank you so much. That's fantastic, and a really good overview of the whole project. I'm particularly interested in the maturity framework, so I'm going to go and have a look at that in more detail myself as well. There are no questions in the chat in the Q&A at the moment for you, Banaz, but I guess people can just get in touch if they want to find out more, and we can drop the links into the chat of the resources that you've mentioned in the presentation today. So what I'm going to do is say thank you again so much for joining us, and I'm going to hand over to our panel now. I'm really delighted that Hayley Shaw, who is the Research Culture Manager at the University of Bath, will be chairing this discussion, and I'll be moderating the questions. So yeah, over to you, Hayley.
Thank you so much, Claire, for both the introduction and the invitation to participate. I know that we've all been really looking forward to this. Thanks also to Alex and Banaz for such detailed and insightful presentations as well. It's a really good starting point for us to sort of take inspiration and learning in this discussion. As Claire said, I'm Hayley. I'm Research Culture Manager at the University of Bath, and together with Lucy Millington, who's currently on a career break, and Ted Spilsbury, who's in our panel, have been co-leading the Research Assessment Reform Project at Bath, and I have the pleasure of being a member of our Open Research Steering Group as well. So I hope to help us navigate this discussion. With us, we have Helen Young, who's Associate Director of Research Excellence at the University of Bristol, Ted Spilsbury, who's Research Culture Project Coordinator at the University of Bath, and also Gareth Cole, who is Open Research Manager at the University of Exeter. So thank you so much to all of our panel members for joining. We're going to try and have around a sort of 7 or 8 minute presentation from each, and Claire's going to help us keep time there before a bit of a discussion. I suppose just framing this session, I just wanted to, I think, build on the presentations to acknowledge that rewarding open research often involves system level reform and cultural change, and that can look really different across different disciplines, institutions and contexts. And so in that context, experimentation and learning is really, really important. It's sort of both legitimate and necessary. And so in this panel, we're hoping to have some of that open and reflective discussion from different organisational journeys through this process, so that we can learn and share, and importantly work together as well to continue to promote more recognition of open research in the system. So just by way of reminder, there is a Q&A option for people to pop any questions in, and we will hopefully have some time for panel discussion at the end. So I think we're all set there. With that, I'm going to invite the first presentation from Helen, who's going to talk us through experiences at the University of Bristol.
Thanks very much, Hayley, and afternoon, everybody. So obviously, coming at it from the perspective of open research, I've been asked to reflect on the University of Bristol's emerging work around responsible research assessment, particularly our CoARA action plan, which is in the final stages of drafting, but I suppose also our commitments to DORA, the Barcelona Declaration on Open Research Information, and underpinning frameworks for good research practice, such as the Research Integrity Concordat. I think I'm going to start by picking up on Alex's analysis, because the observation that CoARA action plans are quite values-led, with open research appearing more in the framing than in specific actions, really resonates. And as Alex mentioned towards the end of his talk there, a lot of these plans are being developed while key questions are still being worked through. So in our case, we've leaned into that quite deliberately. We've taken an approach that starts with a longer scoping phase, so the plan is intentionally more principles-led at this stage, with more defined actions emerging through that process. I think it also reflects a broader shift across the sector. There's now quite strong alignment on the principles around open research and responsible assessment, but the real challenge is how those principles show up in practice. So in hiring, in promotion, and in how we evaluate research more broadly, which shapes what we pay attention to and prioritise. We've been active in the open research space at Bristol for a number of years. That's not a surprise to anyone on this call, I don't think, particularly through our work with UKRN. And the dedicated efforts of our library and research culture teams, alongside many others across the institution. And I would like to give a quick shout out to Lavinia and Richard, who are on the call, because their contributions in this space have and continue to be considerable. And I think that's a useful reminder, actually, that it's ultimately people, not processes, that drive change. As important as the processes are, the system change, people are the key feature of this. We also played an important early role in the development of UKRN, particularly through the leadership of Marcus Manafo, which has helped position us strongly with a wider open research landscape. So we're definitely not starting from scratch, There's a good level of activity and engagement across the institution. But the key question for us now is what difference that's actually making to how research is recognised and rewarded, and ultimately to how research is done. And the honest answer is that we're not fully there yet, and potentially not that close, I would say. I might be shot down for that, but I think it's worth being honest. Open research is widely supported and increasingly well understood, but it's not yet consistently reflected in decision making. So we have a strong commitment, excellent pockets of practice and growing capability, but less consistency in how that translates into things like promotion or internal evaluation. Like in simple terms, it's often encouraged, but not yet systematically rewarded. So drawing loosely on the UKRN maturity framework, a helpful way of describing where we're at, I suppose, is somewhere between emerging and evolving. We've built the foundations, but we're still working towards embedding those principles more consistently in assessment and recognition. There are definitely some things that have worked well. And like I say, Lavinia and Richard would be much better at talking this through, and I'm not trying to be comprehensive, but just to pick a few things out. One is capability. Our PGR training has grown significantly over the last 18 months, moving from relatively limited provision to much more tailored sessions that frame open research as something that improves quality and saves time rather than as an additional burden. Not that it was ever framed like that, but that's how it was read. That shift has really increased both reach and engagement, with some sessions which have now been done via the Southwest Doctoral Training Partnership, drawing well over 100 participants. Really good news. That's been especially important in areas like arts, humanities and social sciences, where open research hasn't always been part of the conversation, and where we're now starting to see much stronger uptake. Alongside that, our work with UKRN has helped us build a wider community of practice across disciplines and roles, including through Train the Trainer activity that is now being taken forward within faculties. And we're also starting to broaden what we recognise and value in terms of research contributions, for example, through co-production, partnerships with the creative sector and recognising research enabling roles, alongside more practical developments in areas like open access, data practices and research transparency. So there is real progress there, and I don't want to diminish that, but it hasn't yet translated into a fundamental shift in incentive structures. And that's the key challenge we're now facing. So for us, the CoARA action plan is less about committing to these principles, though the document itself may be very principle heavy. We've already done that, and it's more about embedding them into systems that shape behaviour. So we signed, I think, as Claire introduced, the CoARA, or the Agreement on Reforming Research Assessment, last year, established a responsible research assessment working group at the end of the year, and now have a draft action plan moving towards approval. And our approach is deliberately phased and evidence-led. So we're starting by understanding how assessment actually works across the institution, where decisions are made, what evidence is used, and where there are inconsistencies. So that includes looking at the data that underpins those decisions, linked to our, again, emerging work on the Barcelona Declaration, to make sure we're using information in a way that aligns with responsible research principles. From there, we're going to be identifying what we can change now and what needs longer term approach. Some things like guidance or aspects of ref preparation can move relatively quickly, indeed have to move relatively quickly. Others, like promotion criteria or hiring practices, are more deeply embedded and will take longer. So CoARA in that sense is helping us to be both ambitious and realistic. We're also very conscious that this work involves balancing different drivers, research quality, openness, disciplinary differences, and institutional priorities like reputation and sustainability. So it's not about replacing one system with another, but about evolving it in a more transparent and balanced way. And underpinning all this is a simple point: recognition and reward drive behaviour. So this is also where the link to research integrity is really important, because responsible research assessment is about aligning how we define, assess and evidence research quality with what good, rigorous and transparent research practice actually looks like, building on the foundations set out in the Research Integrity Concordat. If we want to see more open and transparent research practices, we have to recognise the time, effort and expertise they require. Is that my minute, Claire? Thank you. That applies at every level, from individual researchers through to how schools and faculties prioritise and resource activity. because when something is genuine valued, people and institutions invest in it. That's very much how we're approaching this through CoARA, drawing on frameworks like SCOPE to think carefully about what we value in research and how that's reflected in the systems we design and implement. And this is where initiatives like OR4 are helpful, because one of the challenges has been defining what good looks like in practice. Having more structured ways of recognising open research is key to embedding it consistently. So to bring that together, I describe Bristol as being in a transition phase. We've built strong foundations, we've developed capability and engagement, and now the focus is on embedding those principles into the systems that shape behaviour. CoARA gives us a structured way to do that, one that's principled, but also pragmatic about what can realistically be achieved. And ultimately, that's what will determine whether open research is genuinely rewarded rather than being simply encouraged. Thank you very much.
Helen, thank you so much. What a phenomenal kind of kickoff to this discussion. That was really, really helpful and draws upon so many things, getting these things into practice, valuing the people that lead that kind of change and transition and not losing that link to integrity as well. So thank you so much. A reminder to colleagues that you can put questions as you kind of these thoughts percolate and raise in your minds. And we're going to take some of those at the end of all of the presentations. So with that, I'm going to now invite Ted to offer a perspective on Bath's journey with rewarding open research and responsible research assessment in particular. Ted, over to you. I think you have some slides to share as well.
Yes, I will just share my slides. Okay. So I'll just make it full screen. There we go. Okay, so thanks, Hayley. So as you say, I have been working on a responsible research assessment project at Bath Uni. So my current focus is developing and delivering in-person responsible research assessment workshops for frequent assessors and embedding those practices, those RRA practices across the university. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. So just to give a bit of institutional background to where we're coming from. So Bath's commitment to open research and assessment goes back to a 2022 Open Research Action Plan, which contained a formal commitment to introduce open research criteria in recruitment and promotion. In 2024, a research culture consultation identified a gap where existing principles were being inconsistently applied. So open research outputs were perceived as undervalued and staff couldn't translate those principles into practice without the guidance. So when a new research culture action plan was published in December of 2024, one of the pillars was research recognition. So that incorporated commitments to reviewing responsible research assessment practices and to embedding them and open research in updated promotions criteria. So as a timely coincidence, there was an arrival of a new Vice Chancellor who prioritised HR's review of a new promotions framework. And this created an opportunity to embed our developing principles in one of the university's most important assessment processes. And because this happened in tandem with our RRA work, we were able to embed our principles into the promotions criteria, which is obviously a significant boost to the implementation of our plans. Having that institutional backing, and then that's made it easier to deliver training and tell people that the big institutional processes are changing too. So in terms of the actions that were taken, we signed DORA in last year in 2025 and adopted the 4 core commitments of CoARA. We updated our existing principles of research assessment and management, including a new principle that explicitly recognises all contributions and outputs of research, such as data, software and policy interventions, alongside traditional outputs, and especially valuing those that contribute to robustness, openness and transparency. We published new RA guidance, which amongst other things maps how researchers can evidence quality through open research practices. So that could be open data downloads, open access publishing, credit statements. And then we also implemented mandatory RRA training for frequent assessors, incorporating an online Moodle course and a 2.5-hour in-person workshop. Those frequent assessors are heads of department, associate deans for research and deans, as well as other senior people across the university. So by the time we complete the programme, all of those senior colleagues across the institution should have completed the mandatory training. And this next slide is just an example of the guidance that we've issued to frequent assessors, and the ones which are in bold are the types of evidence which specifically reference open research practices. So all of this needed to be integrated with the university policy and practice. So we're currently working with HR on a project to update promotions criteria to include the research integrity as an essential criterion at all grades, with examples centred on open research practices as evidence of transparency and integrity. So these initiatives are being coordinated by us in the research culture team and the open research steering group, but that's done in cooperation with teams across the whole university. So it doesn't just encompass promotions policies and RA training, but we're also seeking to embed policy in other processes across the university, such as recruitment, probation, and internal funding opportunities. We have made the RA training mandatory rather than voluntary, although people are able to undertake it voluntarily as well. That reflects an institutional commitment to responsible research assessment. Getting it to be made mandatory did require quite a lot of governance approval, including multiple papers to multiple committees across the university. So Senate, Research and Knowledge Exchange Committee, Academic Staff Committee, Staff Experience Advisory Board. But importantly, making that mandatory means that we can actually reach all of the assessors who need it rather than just those who are already engaged. So just in terms of a few reflections and lessons learned from that whole process. First lesson is that principles need to be backed up by the guidance and training. So we'd had principles of research assessment since 2017, but there was a big gap between having that policy and actually making the practice real. Secondly, the work is incremental. We had to obtain lots of step-by-step approvals from various committees, which took quite a lot of time, but hopefully that effort that we put in builds durable institutional buy-in. Third, conducting the workshops, and now we're halfway through the workshops, there's still some more to hold, but conducting them has been a real opportunity to surface feedback from researchers and assessors about their own difficulties. So one example is the question of data sets and software. What does good look like? How do you assess them? This is something that we haven't yet fully tackled, but we know it's an area where bigger sector-wide initiatives, such as the work being done by the Hidden Ref project, are really important. And then fourthly, we're now at a key moment in that change process. So we've implemented principles and guidance, and we've nearly completed the mandatory training, but there's still obviously a long way to go. Just making sure that the training's done doesn't mean that the change happens immediately, and it's going to be a sort of 1, 2, 3, 4 year process before we really feel confident in being able to say that it's complete. In terms of what we've also tried to do is benchmark our process against the OR4 maturity framework. It's a way to locate where we are in our journey. So we'd say that we're strongest and probably would describe ourselves as evolving in institutional commitment, leadership, and strategy and planning. And I think that the work I've described today sort of reflects that. We've got senior buy-in from senior leaders, a clear institutional commitment and a coherent plan. Where we're still emerging is in communication and encouragement. So policy and procedure and support systems and processes. That last one in particular connects to something I touched on briefly earlier. So assessors told us they weren't always confident assessing different output types, such as data sets and software. So we need to define what does good look like, how do you assess them fairly? And that's one of our priority next steps, is providing reviewers with more specific guidance on different output types and strengthening the focus on open research within the training itself. And we're also looking to do more baselining and analysis of how open research is actually being recognised in formal processes. So in promotions cases and the like, so that we can start to measure whether what we're doing is actually making a difference in practice. So that's where we are. We've made a lot of great progress, and we feel like we're travelling in the right direction. But there's a lot still to do, and the journey is going to be quite a long one, I think.
Ted, thank you so much. That was really comprehensive, really clear, and gives a really good sense, I think, of kind of the journey taken so far. And thanks so much to Helen for kind comments in the chat. Conscious of time, I'm going to move this straight to Gareth for final reflections from the University of Exeter and sort of your journey so far as well. So Gareth, over to you, and thanks again to Ted.
Yeah, thank you to both. I'll try and follow those. I'm not sure how I can, but I'll do my best. I'll try and be fairly brief to leave enough time for kind of discussion afterwards. I just wanted to come to this really from an open research angle, as kind of the guy who has open research manager in his job title. And I think certainly at Exeter, it's quite disparate kind of how, but in a good way, kind of how we kind of support and how we do, in inverted commas, kind of open research. So we have kind of the open research team that I manage in the library. We have our liaison librarians, which includes at the moment kind of fixed term research dissemination officer, so kind of looking at that wider aspect of disseminating research. But we also have our UKRN network leads. We've got 20 plus academic open research champions. We have our research division, we've got IT services, kind of all of those kind of professional services and academics, kind of all of those bodies and entities involved in kind of open research. And I think that partly leads into then kind of how we're doing kind of doing inverted commas responsible research assessment, because we've already got that grounding with an open research aspect across a kind of a wide variety of both the academic and professional services angles. So within that, we've had a responsible research assessment. Well, we do have a responsible research assessment group. We signed CoARA. I'm going to get this wrong. So either end of November or early December. I forget exactly the exact date, unfortunately, but at the end of 2025. But I'll say that responsible research assessment group, that is kind of academics and professional services staff, I think, to reflect certainly within kind of that open research area, kind of the breadth of kind of people involved in that. It's academic chaired, so it's chaired by one of the profs here at Exeter. We were previously a signatory to DORA, and we're now currently working on our CoARA action plan. So we're probably that little bit further behind kind of where Bristol is in terms of where kind of Helen was describing. We've had 2 meetings. We're up to commitment 2 in terms of kind of where we might draft our what we might draft on that action plan. So I'll say that's been led by kind of a subgroup of the responsible research assessment group, but it's looking at kind of what is important to Exeter. So Alex described a kind of a pretty comprehensive analysis of kind of existing CoARA action plans. We weren't quite that extensive, but we did look at some of the UK-based ones, kind of what was already out there in terms of the action plans, kind of, and then synthesize those. So different members of the subgroup kind of looked at different plans that already existed, kind of looking at what we could borrow, adapt, learn, reuse in the best possible sense of open research, and kind of let's not reinvent the wheel. If someone else has already come up with a good idea that we can implement, let's look at that. And I think it's what I want to say is we are focused on kind of the 4 core commitments. I wanted to kind of an overview of kind of some other work that I think is that Ted and Helen kind of alluded to, but maybe didn't mention explicitly, kind of that we're doing here at Exeter. One of those is, and we're by no means alone, I think most universities have signed up, but to the technicians commitment. And certainly from an Exeter perspective, that's been taken quite inclusive and quite diverse as to what it means to be a technician. So I know that different institutions kind of have kind of put different boundaries around what they mean within the technician's commitment for various reasons and for obvious reasons. But Exeter's has taken quite a broad remit within that. And interestingly, it's the kind of that technicians commitment group that kind of owns, in inverted commas, our kind of attribution policy, kind of who or what should be included as a kind of as an author or versus a contributor. So kind of credit and other things have already been mentioned. But I think kind of that diverseness and inclusivity within technicians has kind of fed into kind of what we include in kind of the attribution policy, which then obviously feeds into kind of who and what is assessed and who and what is included as part of that piece of assessment. So I think that's been quite an important aspect. I've mentioned UKRN and others have mentioned that as well, but also kind of things like practice-based research, kind of creative arts, kind of practice-based. So we hosted a hidden ref workshop October, November time last year, again to kind of understand, similar to kind of what Ted was saying, kind of how do you assess kind of the so-called non-traditional outputs, or kind of that fully diverse range of outputs. So again, it's kind of it was almost beginning those conversations similar to the other institutions as to kind of how we can support kind of that diverse range of outputs, but also that diverse range of contributors to those outputs, so not just on the academic side, but with kind of that professional services or technical services side as well, as to kind of who's included as part of that assessment process. And then I just wanted to finish really with, I don't know if they're provocations or not, my notes to myself, called them challenges / opportunities, but within kind of the open research remit. And so these are very much my perspectives rather than kind of the University of Exeter's thoughts at this stage. But I think it's interesting, and a number of the other presenters have mentioned it today, around kind of what we mean by open in practices when we're talking in different disciplinary contexts, when we're talking about assessment of outputs or assessment of research. Some of you and some of the kind of the attendees today may have been in the Morph session that we had as part of GW4 on Tuesday, where they kind of outlined kind of the HAS catalogue, or the catalogue of kind of HAS research practices and open research practices they've developed, and kind of their findings, and others have mentioned this as well, that kind of a lot of the open research kind of monitoring, assessment, wording, definition, open research, open science, whatever we want to call it, is almost seen through kind of a STEM lens. So kind of what does that mean for when we're talking about responsible research assessment? Are a lot of the things that we're including in our action plans, are they still seen through that lens? And I think that's quite an interesting angle, that certainly that made me think about kind of where we might want to take some of that work at Exeter, building on kind of what Morphs have done and kind of what they're developing. I also, I think it was Helen, thank you, Claire. I think it was Helen kind of spoke about systems, but and kind of in the context of kind of changing culture, but also I think it's important we actually look at our technical system, the actual kind of software in the systems as well, and kind of the language they use, and kind of, it might just be my experience, but I would argue that our systems in many ways aren't ready for a diverse range of outputs and contributions. Forget the culture. Don't forget the culture, but outside of the culture, our technical systems aren't ready for it either, and don't reflect those challenges, whether it be a fine art person or a sculptor. How are they reflected within our technical systems? And then I just wanted to kind of finish with professional services staff as researchers. Others have mentioned that kind of attributions and contributions of kind of research adjacent, also called research adjacent staff, but also thinking of those kind of professional services, those research adjacent staff as researchers in their own right, and kind of what that means for our culture, what that means for our systems and everything else going forward. So yeah, that's kind of where I wanted to finish, but hopefully with kind of an extra lens, but kind of through that open research aspect as well. So thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. That was such a inspiring and kind of interesting set of observation. I could see lots of us kind of nodding along, saying yes, the systems, and yes. And I'm so glad that you drew the connection to the technicians' commitment as well, and some of our research enabling colleagues, and making sure that we're kind of making space for the recognition of those different output types and contributions in this space too. Fantastic. We've got a couple of questions, I think, in the chat. So I'll just encourage, not every panel member will need to answer every question. So if you just would like to contribute, please come forward. We don't have too long, so let's try and keep answers a tiny bit brief so that we can try and make some space. So one, Ted, was for you, was about how mandatory training was received by attendees, and whether or not we can speak about any of the impact that might have had already, even if just anecdotally, recognising that it can be challenging to get people on board, in particular the senior management colleagues that have been targeted through Bath's scheme.
Yeah, I'd say you're right in that it is difficult, and just managing people, very senior people's diaries can be really challenging sometimes. In terms of how it's been received, I'd say because of the mix of disciplinaries, disciplinary specialisms and personality types, there is a bit of a mixed bag. I'd say that some people are really open to it and they've gone away saying, this is great, I'm going to run a workshop with my own department to talk about all of this. And obviously there are some people who are maybe holdouts who are, a bit grumbly about having to do mandatory training, as I think is probably quite common. I think it's all quite hopeful so far, and the fact we have got the backing from the university means that people are going away committing to making changes. Some of those are obviously going to be more willing than others, but I'd say generally it's been quite positively received so far.
Thanks, Ed. Really helpful. And then a question for all panelists. So yesterday we presented some results. This is from Lavinia. Yesterday we presented some research from the UKRN, excuse me, Open Research Survey, and recognising contributions wasn't one of the main barriers highlighted to researchers. So it's not that it wasn't irrelevant, but that it was perhaps secondary to other facilitators, like having more time or guidance. Why do you think we may have got these results? Has anyone got any reflections on that?
I've got an immediate reflection on that, just off the top of my head, is I think it's often because they compartmentalize that recognizing contributions from the time and guidance, rather than seeing that actually we get the recognition in the broadest terms. It's not just about an individual within a kind of certain process, even just an annual review, right? Being told, oh, we really recognize this and it's good work. It's the point again about what kind of gets time put towards it and prioritized is the thing then that people have time to do. And so it's a really complicated picture, and I don't think people necessarily see it like that because there's lots of angles to it and a complexity that's outside the individual's control. So that you're asking individuals to say what would make a difference to you, they don't have control of a lot of that stuff. So I think it's hard for them they'll resort to saying, well, I need more time, because that is the critical thing. How you get more time is the bit about recognizing those contributions appropriately in the right places. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure it's spiky across institutions as well. I know when we ran a survey on open research a couple of years ago, I think I'm going to forget the numbers now. Colleagues on the call, Alan, colleagues may remember, but I think around 40% of people had highlighted sort of that hiring and promotion and recognition there was kind of a key part of it as well. So Gareth, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, again, just speaking on the top of my head, I wonder, a lot of universities already have kind of OR within kind of promotion criteria. And I wonder actually whether, not that it's by no means a done deal in that sense, but whether because that's already in there, they're looking at kind of other things that may be a barrier because they can already include OR as part of their promotion. Hiring might be different, but as part of their promotion. So I guess it might be interesting to do a comparison with the researchers who were saying it wasn't as important or a barrier. Were they working at institutions that already had open mentioned within promotion criteria, for example?
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Another question just in from Aaron. Thank you so much. So lack of incentives to rewarding open research practice is a problem. Is there anything that we can do in this climate of tightening budgets? It's an interesting one because I think some of this is about sort of signalling recognition and signalling the value that this will hold within broader kind of processes, and less so about immediate sort of monetary rewards. But I don't know what your kind of reflections are from across the panel in other institutions. Helen, you were nodding.
Yeah, no, I would. That's kind of where my head went in that space of like, it's tricky, but a lot of this, yes, is about, but again, it's that more complex picture of where are you getting the attention paid to this, and what's that feeding into decisions that are being made, and how does that then filter through down to individuals or project, teams. So I think not being afraid to try and push forward with this despite the context, being realistic about what's going to be achieved, but kind of pushing the question, I suppose, like just as you've done, Hayley, is this might be the notion of what you think this looks like, and we can't do it because there's a price tag, to what can we do. And like Gareth and both Ted were saying, there are lots of things already in train, already done, that we can maybe just pick up and make sure are better connected or have better visibility. I mean, some of the stuff absolutely, Gareth, on the systems, because I obviously have kind of a systems kind of side to my remit and have Pure at Bristol. And we're really committed to trying making best use of kind of our resources and making them work for this, because they shouldn't be a barrier, they should be an enabler. But that takes time and kind of, you know, monetary probably commitment to improving that. So yes. I don't know if that answers it very well, but I think that's the thing. Still try and do something.
No, that's fantastic. And I suppose just with a few minutes to go, you know, recognizing that this is a complex space, that there are sort of challenges out there, and that institutional processes and practice can take time. Maybe let's end with something hopeful. So, I mean, what are the things that are making each of you feel hopeful about implementing recognition and reward for open research within your institutions? Can I invite some final reflections on that?
Shall I go?
All jump at once. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I'll go. It might be a slightly glib answer, but the fact it's being talked about. Yeah. I remember I started working in open back in, I don't know, 2011, 2012. And actually where we've come certainly as a UK sector in this conversation in the last decade and a half, or even the last decade, I think is actually quite a long way. We look at, we always want to go further. There's always more we want to do, but actually looking at where we were and where we are now, it's kind of on the journey, on the timeline. As I said, lots of institutions have open within kind of reward criteria. Almost everyone signed up to DORA. Increasingly, people are signing up to CoARA. We've now got institutions signing up to Barcelona, etc. I think that awareness, that understanding at senior managers, it's not, in a lot of conversations, it's not what is open, it's kind of how do we do it, and how can we implement it, and how should we implement it at our institution. That's certainly the case, I think, here at Exeter. And I think that certainly wasn't the case when I started working in this space. So that's my positive, I think.
Great, thank you so much for that. Ted or
Helen,
did either one you?
Yeah, go ahead. Come in quickly. It's a very personal reflection, just having set up, and I chair the, I know I'm not academic, but I chair the Responsible Research Assessment Group for hopefully obvious reasons. And I've just been really heartened by actually, we've only, been together a few months really, but the progress we've made by having honest conversations. And we've titled our plan Holistic Context Sensitive Action Plan, because it's like, how do we make this work at Bristol? And there's been such a level of engagement, and from a starting point of people not really understanding what this even meant, to people who genuinely, even if they're coming from a very different place with different pressures, are engaging. So I think, you know what, you need to start the conversation, be honest, and see how you can make it work. And I'm definitely in a positive space myself and of how we can move this forward. I'm realistic but positive.
That's great. Thank you so much. Ted, is there anything that you'd want to add to that?
Well, yeah, I was just going to say that it's very similar for us, and the positive for us is that we've got people right from the top of the university all the way through who are really passionate about it. Having people like the Vice Chancellor and the Deputy Vice Chancellor pushing it forward is great, but then just doing the workshops with people sort of on the ground and having them go away feeling super engaged and energetic about it and going away enthusiastic, wanting to do their own things with their own departments, shows that people want to do it. It might not be uniform, but just having some people on the ground who want to kind of spread good practice is just really positive and hopeful for us.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, everyone. I know that we're at time now. Claire, shall I hand back to you just to say a final thanks? But really appreciate the opportunity to bring all this to the fore and hopefully create a space that we can connect with each other, colleagues on the call, to kind of keep innovating and keep things moving forward in this space. Thank you, Claire. Over to you for a final word.
Thank you to all the panelists and Hayley for a great job. I think I don't have anything really to add, but thank you to everybody for coming. If you want to get in touch with us individually, please feel free to. If you don't know who to get in touch with, email me. I can help put you in touch with other people across GW4. There are sessions available for the rest of the week, and tomorrow's is on the hidden ref, which has cropped up a few times today. In due course, I'm not sure exactly when, but we'll put all of this on YouTube so you can share with others if you think they'd be interested in catching up. But yeah, a big thanks to everyone who participated and to the speakers. And no doubt this is the beginning of a continued conversation.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Bye.
I was just going to say thanks, Hayley. I was just